last week we started putting the vine in place, and so now our next task is to do the leaves. Now this is the part, this is where I started my vine. So this is actually the first leaf that I can do. So I'm going to do this one, and then I'm going to come over and do the base here of the strawberry. I've also referred to these as flowers, but traditionally this is considered to be a strawberry vine sampler border. And so I'm going to continue on around. Now, I don't want to have to stop and start every time I move from one motif to another, but this is a very dark color, so I do need to be careful. So I'm going to use the existing vine as a place to bury my traveling thread. The other thing that helps with a traveling thread, when possible, to transition on the diagonal. The thread will not show as much when you travel it on the diagonal as when you go on the horizontal or vertical. So this first leaf attaches at the base of this set of 2 stitches. And as usual, I'm starting with a loop start. I'm going to have to keep my chart handy because of the circular nature of this border. The leaves do not attach in any sort of predictable way. So that finishes that first little leaf. And my next thing is over here. So I have to think about the best way to get over there. So again, as I said, if you carry your thread on the diagonal, if I carry it like this, it's less likely to show than if I go straight across. So I'm just going to slip it under a stitch right there and slip it under this right here, and that brings me up to where I want to stitch. Now I have to really think about this. I think I'm going to stitch this going upward first. So I'm not going to necessarily turn my work upside down for this, but I'm stitching this from the base up toward the top. And I've got 3 stitches in this column. And then I have 2 stitches, one that's just right above that last stitch. Oops. And then one right below that. And I see I have a mistake right there. Let me fix that. As long as I've unthreaded my needle, I'm going to do my thing where I separate my 2 threads a little bit more effectively, just by putting my needle between the 2 threads and pulling it all the way along the length of the 2 strands. And I'm going to go ahead and dampen it again too, I think. Mainly just to get that little kink out. I had gone in the middle of that stitch instead of over here in the corner where I should be. That looks better. So now I've got 2 stitches in the next column. Don't always think in terms of rows. Sometimes it makes sense to work in columns, and sometimes it makes sense to work on the diagonal. So this is just one of the many ways to do this configuration. Okay, so now I've ended up here, and my next stitches are down here. So I'm just going to place my needle there for a second and show you on the back that I'd be carrying my thread like that. And I think that's just a little longer than I really want to carry it. So I'm going to slip it under a stitch just to anchor it there. Now, just to show you there's no single way to do this, I've done my 2 single stitches, and now I'm going to do these 2 stitches that are side by side. And then do the final stitch. So don't feel locked into just one method of stitching. Now, one of the reasons I did it that way was so that I could end up as close as possible to my next leaf, which is going to be approximately right here. So I'm going to stick my needle right here for a second. I'm pretty sure that's the right place. Let's take a look at the chart. So I did this little stitch, I've done this base of the strawberry, and now I want to do this part right here. So it is attached to the outside upper corner of this double stitches right here. So yes, that's the right place. Now let's look on the back and see that where that thread would travel. So the thread would be going from there to here, which is probably okay. Yeah, so let's just do that. I'm kind of pleasantly surprised. And now, those of you with a sharp eye see that I'm actually stitching this with the Victorian method. So again, you know, whatever works for the circumstances. So there's the bottom 2 stitches. And now above that, I'm going to jump over to the Danish method and stitch the top 2 stitches. Now I also have a stitch that attaches over here. I'm gonna, I think I want to anchor that thread right here. So I'm attaching to this one. So I'm going to come down 2 threads. have 2 more stitches beneath these. Okay, and now there's also a leaf up here. So this is where I'd be going. And that's almost straight up, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to actually come under, I'm going to anchor under a couple of existing stitches. Oops, I missed one. Okay, the next leaf attaches right here. And I'm going to revert to the Danish method. Okay, now my next leaf is here. And before I started from the stem and worked out. But when you look at where I am on the chart, I just finished this leaf. The closest thing is to come and do these 2 stitches next. So this is where you have to think about where you're aligning this. And I think the easiest way to pick up with where I want to be is under this stitch right here. I'm going to leave 2 empty squares on your Aida. That's 4 threads on linen. And come down yet 1 more square and do this stitch right here. So I'm under this stitch right here, but I'm leaving 4 linen threads unworked. That's 2 squares on Aida, and coming down yet 1 more square or 2 more threads to do that next stitch right here. See if my thread's gonna last here. I'm getting kind of down to the end of my strand. So this gives you an idea of many different ways that you can tackle these leaves and where you can attach them to the vine and where you can kind of just skip over. So I'm going to anchor that thread on the back and thread up another strand and do some more leaves. As I start this next strand with the next pair of leaves, it occurs to me to offer one other tip to you, and that is to use a highlighter to highlight the leaves that you have finished so that you will be very aware if you have missed one. Although it wouldn't be a disaster to have to go back and add a leaf, it's just so much easier to do it while you're there. Now the next leaf is right above this one. So I'm going to slip under just one stitch here on the back. Oops. Now you'll notice, those of you who have paid attention to my advice to start in an empty hole and end your stitch in a filled hole whenever you can, that I'm doing it backwards here. But also notice I'm being very careful to make sure that as I start that stitch, that I'm not splitting the stitch below it. I'm making sure that I'm coming right in the hole and there's no obstruction. So before I go any further, I want to follow my own advice and mark off the stitches that I've done and make sure that they correspond to the ones that I think that I've done. This stitch right here is the one that I just finished. So I want to come down and do this stitch next. So there's several ways I can figure out how to get there. I think the thing that makes the most sense to me is to think of coming over one square and then leaving 1, 2, 3 squares unworked. And then this is what I'm going to stitch next. So from that last stitch, I'm coming over one. It's 1 Aida square or 2 linen threads. There are 3 squares unworked. So there's 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to be stitching right here. Now, one way to double check that is that stitch is right above this one. So let's look on the chart and see if that lines up. The stitch that I'm aiming to do, this one right here, is right above the second stitch in this row. So basically I'm going to be doing 2 stitches right over top of these 2 stitches, and there's 1 stitch unworked in between them. So yes, that's exactly where I am. So it's good to pick 2 ways to confirm that you're putting your stitches where you're supposed to put them. When you can do that. I mean, I just feel like that the more care I take in making sure that I'm stitching in the right place, the less chance there is that I'm going to have to rip something out and restitch it. Now you may be wondering, here I am going straight across the horizontal to carry this thread, when earlier I said that it would be better to carry your traveling thread on a diagonal. But remember that traveling thread is unlikely to show because it's right above these stitches from the stem. And when I talk about showing, obviously they don't, they're not evident right now. It's when you go to frame it that it seems like that traveling threads will show through. The strawberries are stitched with 3 shades of the pink or rose color, starting with the darkest one, which is the symbol that sort of looks like an asterisk. So I'm going to pull 1 strand from this thread drop. Set these all aside. Now this strand is 30 inches long, and I'm not I don't want to carry my traveling thread from one strawberry to another. And so to minimize the waste, I'm going to actually cut this 30-inch strand into three 10-inch pieces. And rather than get up and go find a ruler, which I don't happen to have handy, I'm just going to basically cut this into thirds. And I think that piece is going to be long enough to do I think it's about 9 stitches of this color in each one of the strawberries. So first I'm going to straighten it out, which again, the only purpose in doing that is to minimize the knots and tangles as I stitch. Now I'm just going to work back up the row, or I should say column, and it's every other stitch. And it looks like my 10 inches is going to be enough, but not a generous amount. And now I just need to anchor that, and that color is done. So that's not a whole lot left, but it was sufficient. Now I'm going to continue the same process with each one of the strawberries that I have set up, and then I'll add the second color. The next color, which is the diamond shape, has just about the same number of stitches. There's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches of that color as well. So I'm going to do the same thing and cut my 30-inch length of floss into 3 pieces. I think I'm going to tackle this in rows. So right now this is an empty space between two darker pink colors. So I'm going to have 2 stitches here, and then a single one, and then 3, and then a single, and then a double. I had to pause there for a second and look at my chart to make sure I was doing this right. So this is where I'm going to actually have 3 stitches in this row. These colors are so close to each other. Do make sure that you're not picking up the wrong one when you change sections. That's one reason I went on and did all 3 of the pieces that I cut of the dark color. And I'll do all 3 of the ones of this medium color before I go on. And again, I don't have a generous amount left in my needle, but I do have enough to finish these last 2 stitches and to secure the tail sufficiently on the back. And that's all I really need. Since this strawberry lies in a different direction, I'm going to tack it a little bit different way. I'm going to do these 3 stitches and then do the row of 5 and then do 1. I'm going to do complete stitches here so that I will end up over on the right hand side, and then I can do the row of 5 in the Victorian cross method. And now just the top center stitch, and the medium color is finished on this one. Now the next strawberry is lying also horizontally, but I'm going to turn my fabric around so now I can stitch this one just like I did the one previously. I'll do these 3 stitches, whoops, I'll do these 3 stitches and then the row of 5 and then the single stitch. So now I have the first 2 colors done for 3 of the strawberries, and now I have the lightest color. There's no hard and fast rule about how to tackle these various stitching decisions, But one of the things I consider is the color that I'm stitching with. And since this is a light color, and because there are only 3 stitches of the light color in each one, I don't want to stop and start each strawberry. So I'm going to work with my 30-inch length. I'll stitch these 3 stitches, and then I'll tunnel under existing stitches and get over to the next spot where I have the 3 stitches, and then tunnel under again to get over here. So I've started my 30-inch strand with the loop method, and I have just these 3 stitches to do right here. So when you're making these stitching decisions, consider the number of stitches you have to do, the color of the floss you're stitching with, where you may have places that you can secure your traveling thread on the back. All of these things will help you make good stitching strategy decisions. So now my next place to go is over here. So I'm just going to put my needle there just for a second and show you on the back. That's where I'm carrying my thread. So a couple things I could do. The most conservative thing would be to come back this way, tunnel all the way under here, etc. But I really don't think that that's necessary. I can also see where, and here's where there's nothing really wrong with this traveling thread, but this would have been better off. I should have slipped it under at least 1 stitch here on the back just to secure it a little bit more. So I'm going to go under here, and by grabbing this stitch right here, I'm also securing that dark green traveling thread. Now from this strawberry, I'm next going over this way. So let's see the best thing to do over here. Now again, whoops, you do want to take this traveling thread on the diagonal when you can. And this is almost straight across. So I'm actually going to come down this way first so that I'm on a diagonal here. And then I'm going to come under this one. So again, I'm bringing it on the diagonal. Now that's all that the strawberries I have done so far with the 2 dark colors. So I'm going to once again park this thread and just leave it in my fabric, but out of the way until I'm ready for it again. So I've just parked that thread out of the way. And that's what you need to do with the little strawberry motifs. And I would just keep working Don't get ahead of yourself. Make sure that you've got the navy blue done before you add the vine, and that you add the leaves before you add the strawberries, and you'll be just fine. So the next thing I'm going to do here is I want to put this tulip motifs in over here. And I think, and then on the other side, the next thing to add are initials right here to the left of the tree. I'm going to start the tulip at the top, and I have this heart already in place. So I see that there's 1, 2, 3 empty squares between the edge of the heart and the beginning of the tulip, and that the top of the tulip aligns with the middle of these 2 stitches. So making sure that I'm working with the correct heart, the upper one, and my stitch is going to line up with this row of stitches, and I'm going to come over 3 stitches. So there's 1, 2, 3. So it'd be 3 squares in Aida, 6 linen threads. Now I'm going to want to stitch this whole thing in the Danish method, so I'm going to go ahead and start with my half crosses, and altogether there are 4 in this row. I stitch 1, skip the space where another stitch would lie. It's going to be an empty space, and then do the next half cross, and then the 4th one. Now I'll go back and cross those, looking to make sure that my threads are parallel as I'm stitching, of course. I hope that by now, those of you who are stitching on linen for the first time are finding that you have to search for that vertical thread less and less as you're going along. If I switch to page 6, remember the shaded area also appears on another page, but by looking at page 6, I do have the whole motif on one sheet. So these columns I'm now stitching, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches in each column. Now for the next row, I can either turn this upside down, or I have become quite adept at stitching, just stitching upside down. So whichever way you are more comfortable with, you want to stitch this next column. You're leaving a blank row in between. I kind of had to do a double take to make sure that I was counting correctly, because these stitches do look wider than the others. And this again is a function of having a linen thread in this pair that's a little wider than normal. And again, that's just a characteristic of linen, which I find to be part of what makes it quaint and attractive. I'm really trying hard to accent the positive and not teach and by telling you what not to do. But this is a case where I want to point out that the tendency of novice stitchers is to stitch rows across here. And I want to really urge you not to do that, because you end up with a shadow behind the row that should be blank. We'll talk more about that when we get to the letters, but that's a habit that you kind of have to break. And I realize it's because most diagrams are diagrammed as if all you ever do are rows. But, you know, as you have seen, sometimes what makes sense is to stitch in a column, and sometimes it makes sense to stitch on the diagonal. So there really is not, you know, one size fits all. So now let's make a plan for the green. That's this letter B. I'm going to stitch these 2 stitches and then stitch the 2 leaves and continue on down. And now there's a row of 3. I'm pretty sure, but I'm just going to take a peek at the chart again to make sure. So yes, I had 3 single stitches, and now a row of 3, and then there's going to be 2 and 2. Finishing up that flower pretty much retires this side until I'm ready to do this part of the vine, which I could really do at any point now. Connect where I finished off the vine a couple days ago, well, a couple weeks ago now, and start working up this way. And when I do, I probably will turn this around and turn my work upside down so that I can work in this method. So now taking a look at page 5, what I have left to do are my initials and this little doodad here, which is color number 3. I think I'm going to do that next. Now 3 is the lightest of the shades of pink or rose. And what I'm going to do here, I'll take a strand out. But since I'm only doing 4 stitches, it would just be a waste to thread up that entire length. So again, I'm going to take, in this case, about 1/4 of it. So if I fold this in half and in half again, I'm not going to cut through the both strands, but I'm going to cut through one of them. And that gives me a piece that's going to be plenty long enough for doing 4 stitches. And then I take the piece that's the long piece that's left, and I'm just going to put it right back onto my thread drop. Keeping in mind that I want to count across the shortest distance possible, this is the best place for me to use to align this little motif. So if I find this red stitch on the tree and leave 3 stitches unworked, that's where this one will be. And let's consider that the east or 3 o'clock position. So we have noon, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or north, east, south, and west, however you want to think of it in your mind. But this is the stitch that we'll start with. So counting up from this rosebud, counting over 2, 3 squares are unworked, and come over 1 more to start. And I'm just going to go around counterclockwise. And it looks like 1/4 of a strand was just the right amount to do these 4 little stitches. Now anchoring this, I'm going to kind of go around in a circle. You come under the stitch. Then just one more little insurance. I think I'm going to come across this way. And I can feel it's still pretty flat, so I'm not worried about adding too much bulk to the back. And as always, going to cut this off very, very close. Again, if I'm not sure that I have it secure enough, I go under more stitches on the back. There's no need to leave trailing threads on the back. So now that that is done, now I just have my initials to do. And of course, you have your alphabet in your chart pack. So, and I realize that, and this is a tough thing as a designer. There are some letters that are wider than others, like the letter W. And so if you have especially like if your initials were WW, it would be hard to fit it in this space. So I would say chart it out. You have blank paper in your packet as well. So chart it out and figure out exactly how much space that you need. And you can always start further over this way and certainly end closer to the tree if you need to. The way that you'll stitch this will all depend on the letters of your 2 initials. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this stitched, and that's going to be about it for today. Next week we'll start the quote, and we'll do this little deer, and we'll see what else we can get done. So I hope that you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll be chatting with you next week.